Elijah Carter had it all: billions in the bank, a sprawling mansion in the hills, and the respect of the tech world as the visionary behind Apex Solutions. But what he uncovered during one shocking week as an undercover janitor would shake his company to its core. Employees mocked those who didn't fit a certain mold, hardworking staff were ignored, and even loyal, long-term employees struggled to make ends meet. For Elijah, the discoveries weren't just disturbing, they were personal. The company he had built from the ground up had become a place where people felt invisible. And by the time he revealed his true identity, no one, especially his top executives, was ready for what came next. Before we dive into the story of how Elijah's undercover mission transformed his company, do us a favor. Hit the like button and subscribe so you never miss more stories about integrity, leadership, and making a difference. Now, let's start from the beginning. Elijah Carter was a name synonymous with success. As the CEO and founder of Apex Solutions, he was hailed as a tech genius, a business titan, and an inspiration to millions. At just 39, Elijah was one of the youngest self-made billionaires in the world. His company revolutionized industries with groundbreaking AI solutions, earning accolades and dominating global markets. From glossy magazine covers to keynote speeches at elite conferences, Elijah was the face of innovation. Yet, for all his wealth and achievements, Elijah had not forgotten where he came from. Born and raised in a modest neighborhood in Detroit, Elijah grew up in a family that lived paycheck to paycheck. His mother worked as a nurse, often pulling double shifts, while his father held down 2 jobs as a mechanic and delivery driver. Watching his parents struggle taught Elijah the value of hard work and the importance of resilience. As a teenager, he spent weekends fixing computers in his neighborhood, sparking a passion for technology that would one day change his life. Elijah's brilliance earned him a scholarship to a top university, where he quickly made a name for himself as a prodigy in computer science. By the age of 25, he had founded Apex Solutions in a tiny garage, coding late into the night and pitching his ideas to skeptical investors. Through sheer grit, Elijah turned Apex into a global powerhouse, and within a decade the company was valued at over $50 billion. Despite his outward success, something was gnawing at Elijah. On the surface, Apex Solutions appeared to be thriving. Quarterly earnings shattered records, glowing reviews from industry analysts rolled in, and recruitment campaigns painted the company as a dream employer. Yet, behind closed doors, Elijah had started noticing troubling signs. Employee engagement surveys, once a source of pride, were showing sharp declines. Comments from anonymous workers hinted at burnout, favoritism, and even toxic leadership behaviors. More concerning, the company's turnover rates were climbing, with high-performing employees leaving faster than they could be replaced. Then there were the whispers. Rumors from trusted insiders about unchecked egos, employees who felt invisible, and a growing divide between management and frontline staff. These red flags left Elijah unsettled. Apex had been built on the principles of collaboration, innovation, and respect, but the evidence suggested that the company was drifting further and further from those values. One particular incident solidified Elijah's concerns. During a quarterly meeting, a senior manager dismissed an employee's question about work-life balance with a condescending remark. "This is the big leagues. If you can't handle it, maybe you're not cut out for this." The laughter that followed made Elijah's stomach churn. How could the company he built, where every voice was supposed to matter, turn into this? Elijah tried addressing the issues through traditional means. He asked his HR team to conduct deep-dive surveys. He invited department heads to discuss potential solutions. But every report, every meeting seemed to gloss over the real problems. Executives assured him that the culture was strong and that any complaints were simply growing pains from scaling up. But Elijah wasn't convinced. Data could be manipulated. Polished presentations could hide cracks in the foundation. Elijah's parents had always told him, if you want to understand a problem, go to the source. That advice, combined with his gut instinct, pushed him toward an unorthodox solution. He needed to see the company as it really was, not as the CEO, but as an ordinary worker. He needed to strip away the layers of formality and polish that shielded him from the truth. That's when the idea hit him. What if he went undercover? What if he traded his tailored suits and luxury office for a janitor's uniform and a mop? It sounded crazy at first, a billionaire CEO scrubbing floors and emptying trash cans. But the more Elijah thought about it, the more it made sense. By walking in the shoes of his lowest-paid employees, he could gain unfiltered insight into the culture at Apex. When he shared his plan with his inner circle, his assistant, Camille, and COO, Brandon, their reactions were a mix of shock and concern. Camille, always the pragmatist, raised logistical questions. How are you going to pull this off without being recognized? Brandon, ever the skeptic, warned him of potential backlash if employees discovered the truth before he was ready to reveal it. But Elijah was resolute. If I don't do this, we'll never fix the root of the problem, he told them. This company is my legacy. If it's broken, I need to take responsibility for fixing it. With the help of a professional makeup artist and a meticulous plan, Elijah transformed into Eli, a middle-aged janitor with a salt and pepper beard, wire-rimmed glasses, and a slight southern drawl. Camille coordinated with the janitorial agency contracted by Apex to ensure Elijah's placement at the headquarters. Only a handful of trusted individuals knew about the mission. On the eve of his first shift, Elijah stood in his walk-in closet, staring at his reflection in a janitor's uniform. The man looking back at him was almost unrecognizable. Monica, his wife, walked in and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. "You're putting yourself in a vulnerable position." "I have to do this," Elijah replied. "I need to know the truth. If our employees are suffering, I can't sit in my office pretending everything's fine." The next morning, Elijah left his mansion in an old sedan borrowed from a friend. As he parked in the far corner of Apex's employee lot, his heart pounded. For the first time in years, he felt a mix of nervousness and excitement. He adjusted his glasses, grabbed his cleaning supplies, and walked toward the employee entrance. As Elijah swiped his new ID badge and stepped into the building, he couldn't help but wonder, what would he uncover in the coming days? Elijah sat at the head of a small conference table in his home office, his assistant Camille and COO Brandon seated across from him. The disbelief on their faces was clear, and it wasn't hard to understand why. "Let me get this straight," Brandon said, leaning forward with a skeptical look. "You, a billionaire CEO, want to pretend to be a janitor, scrubbing toilets, emptying trash bins. Why?" Camille, always more diplomatic, added, "Elijah, I see where you're coming from, but this is risky. What happens if someone recognizes you, or worse, if it backfires?" Elijah looked between the two of them, his jaw set. "This company means everything to me. I can't sit in my office waiting for polished reports or canned responses to tell me what's going wrong. I need to see it for myself, raw and unfiltered. If I don't, we'll keep losing good people, and everything I've built will crumble." There was a long pause as the weight of his words settled in the room. Finally, Camille broke the silence. "If you're serious about this, you'll need a foolproof disguise. No one can suspect a thing." Brandon nodded reluctantly. "If we're doing this, we're doing it right. I don't want this turning into a PR nightmare." Over the next week, they worked on Elijah's transformation. Camille brought in a professional makeup artist who specialized in prosthetics. His usually smooth face was aged with subtle lines, and a patchy gray beard was added for authenticity. They traded his tailored suits for a worn uniform, complete with scuffed work boots. To top it off, Elijah practiced a slight southern drawl to mask his familiar tone and inflections. "Eli Carter," he introduced himself to Camille one day during their practice run. "New to the city, just looking for steady work." Camille nodded approvingly, though she couldn't resist a small laugh. "You might just pull this off." At home, Elijah faced a different challenge. His wife, Monica, had always been his anchor, the one who reminded him of his roots whenever the trappings of success threatened to pull him too far away. When he told her about his plan, her reaction was a mix of concern and reluctant admiration. "I understand why you're doing this," she said as they sat together on their balcony, overlooking the city skyline. "But you're putting yourself in a vulnerable position. What if someone doesn't treat you right? What if you see things you're not prepared for?" Elijah reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "Monica, if people aren't being treated right at my company, I need to see it. I can't fix what I don't understand. And if I see something I'm not prepared for, well, that's exactly why I have to do this." Monica nodded, her worry evident but her trust unwavering. "Just promise me you'll be careful, and eat the lunch I pack you. No skipping meals, even as a janitor." The night before his first shift, Elijah stood in front of the mirror, staring at his transformed reflection. Gone was the polished executive. In his place stood a weary man in his 50s, complete with thick glasses and a slight stoop to his posture. Monica appeared in the doorway, holding a small lunch bag. "You know, I always thought you looked good in a suit," she teased. "But this is a new look for you." Elijah chuckled, taking the bag from her. "Not exactly the image of a billionaire, huh?" She kissed his cheek. "No, but you're still the man I married, and that's what matters." The next morning, Elijah drove himself to Apex Solutions, not in his sleek sports car, but in an old, beat-up sedan borrowed from a family friend. He parked far from the executive spaces he normally used and walked toward the employee entrance, carrying a well-worn backpack. His heart pounded as he swiped the temporary ID badge Camille had arranged. "Good morning," the security guard said, barely glancing at him before waving him through. The words were polite enough, but the tone was indifferent, almost dismissive. For the first time in years, Elijah felt completely unseen. The basement-level janitorial office was a stark contrast to the sleek executive suites he was used to. The air was thick with the smell of cleaning chemicals, and the lighting was harsh and fluorescent. A middle-aged woman named Doris greeted him with a gruff nod. "You must be Eli," she said, looking him up and down. "We'll see if you last longer than the last guy." Elijah offered a nervous smile, careful to stay in character. "I'm a hard worker, ma'am. Just tell me what to do." Doris handed him a mop and a bucket, launching into a rapid-fire orientation about cleaning protocols and safety rules. "Stick to your tasks, don't cause trouble, and for God's sake, don't spill anything on the carpets upstairs. Those execs will have your head." As Elijah pushed his cart toward the gleaming lobby, he felt a pang of nervous excitement. He had spent years walking these halls as the man in charge, but now he was just another worker, invisible to those around him. He dipped his mop into the bucket and started cleaning, keeping his ears open and his eyes peeled. Employees streamed into the building, rushing past him without so much as a glance. Some were engrossed in conversations, others glued to their phones. A few muttered polite good mornings as they passed, but most acted as if he didn't exist. It was a stark reminder of how easily people overlook those they deem unimportant. Midway through the morning, a young man in a crisp blazer approached him, barely making eye contact. "There's a spill by the elevator. Take care of it, will you?" Elijah nodded, responding with a quiet, "Yes, sir." The man didn't wait for a response, already walking away. As Elijah cleaned the spill, he overheard snippets of conversations among employees. "Did you hear about the new project? Only the Ivy League grads are getting tapped for it," one voice said, tinged with bitterness. Another replied, "Yeah, no surprise there. This place is all about who you know, not what you can do." Elijah's brow furrowed as he absorbed their words. Was favoritism really that pervasive in his company? By lunchtime, Elijah had made his way to the bustling cafeteria. As he wiped down tables and emptied trash bins, he continued to observe. A group of employees sat at a nearby table, laughing and joking with one another, but their conversation took a sharp turn when a senior manager walked in. "Straighten up," one of them whispered, and the easy camaraderie dissolved into stiff postures and forced smiles. Elijah couldn't help but wonder how much of the culture at Apex was driven by fear rather than respect. As the day wore on, Elijah's initial nerves gave way to a growing sense of determination. The stark invisibility he experienced as a janitor was humbling, but it also opened his eyes to a side of the company he had never seen before. By the time he clocked out, he felt a mix of exhaustion and resolve. The first day had been eye-opening, but he knew it was just the beginning. Elijah had set out to uncover the truth about his company's culture, and he was already starting to see that the reality was far more complex and troubling than he had imagined. Elijah's second day as Eli the janitor began with a renewed sense of purpose. The initial shock of blending into the background had passed, replaced by curiosity about what he might discover. The morning started in the cafeteria, a bustling hub where employees grabbed their coffee and breakfast. As Elijah wiped down tables and emptied trash bins, he caught the attention of a woman behind the serving counter. "Hey there, new guy," she called out with a warm smile. "You must be Eli." Elijah nodded, smiling back. "That's me, first week on the job." "I'm Grace," she said, extending a hand over the counter. Her grip was firm and her smile genuine. "Let me know if you need anything. I've been here long enough to know the ins and outs." Her friendly demeanor stood out in a sea of hurried employees who barely noticed him. They chatted briefly, and Elijah learned that Grace had been with Apex Solutions for over 15 years. "The cafeteria team doesn't get much attention," she admitted, "but we keep the place running, just like everyone else." A little later, as Elijah made his rounds on one of the office floors, he accidentally bumped into an IT technician working under a desk. "Whoa there," the man said, laughing as he steadied himself. "No harm done, though." He emerged from under the desk, brushing off his hands, and introduced himself. "I'm Noah. You must be the new janitor." "Yeah, sorry about that," Elijah said, staying in character. "Didn't mean to interrupt." "No worries," Noah replied, smiling. "It's good to see someone new. If you need help navigating this place, just let me know." Elijah was struck by Noah's kindness. Throughout the day, he noticed Noah going out of his way to help colleagues, from assisting with technical issues to offering a listening ear to an overwhelmed intern. People like Grace and Noah gave Elijah hope that not everything at Apex Solutions was broken. But for every Grace and Noah, there were stark reminders of what was wrong. As Elijah pushed his cleaning cart down one hallway, he overheard a group of employees gathered near the break room. "I swear, these janitors have it easy," one voice said. "Just mop the floors and collect a paycheck. They wouldn't last a day doing what we do." Another chimed in, laughing. They probably think KPIs is a type of cleaning product. Elijah gritted his teeth but kept moving, unwilling to break character. The dismissive comments stung. He knew that many of his frontline workers worked long hours in physically demanding jobs, yet they were seen as invisible by those who benefited from their labor. Later that afternoon, Elijah encountered an even more troubling scenario. While cleaning a conference room, he overheard a team meeting taking place nearby. The discussion was about a new product launch, and a young employee, clearly nervous, spoke up with an idea. "What if we prioritize usability for accessibility?" she suggested. "It could open up the product to a whole new market." There was a brief silence before the team lead responded with a condescending laugh. "That's interesting, but let's focus on ideas that actually align with our brand image." The young woman looked crestfallen as the conversation moved on without further acknowledgement of her suggestion. Elijah couldn't believe it. The idea had genuine potential, but the dismissive tone of the team lead had shut it down without consideration. How many innovative ideas had been lost to this kind of arrogance? The day's most disturbing moment came when Elijah crossed paths with Linda Porter, the head of operations. As Elijah polished the glass walls of her corner office, Linda stormed in, barking orders at her assistant. She barely acknowledged Elijah's presence until, mid-rant, she noticed a streak on the glass he was cleaning. "You missed a spot," she said sharply, pointing with a perfectly manicured nail. "If you can't handle the basics, maybe you should find another job." Elijah apologized, keeping his tone neutral. "I'll fix it right away, ma'am." Linda rolled her eyes and muttered to her assistant, loud enough for Elijah to hear. "Honestly, we should demand higher standards from these contractors. It's embarrassing." The interaction left Elijah seething. Linda was someone he had trusted, a leader he'd relied on to maintain the company's values. Yet here she was, displaying an attitude that embodied everything wrong with the culture at Apex Solutions: dismissive, cold, and focused only on appearances. As the day came to a close, Elijah sat in the janitorial closet, reflecting on what he had seen and heard. The kindness of people like Grace and Noah was heartening, but the overwhelming disrespect towards lower-level employees was impossible to ignore. The casual cruelty of some workers, the arrogance of managers who dismissed innovative ideas, and Linda's disdainful attitude painted a bleak picture of a company culture that had strayed far from its original vision. Elijah felt a deep pang of guilt. He had built Apex Solutions with the dream of creating a company where everyone, from the janitor to the executive, felt valued. But somewhere along the way, the culture had warped into something unrecognizable. He realized that the cracks in the foundation weren't just isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a larger, systemic problem. Sitting there in his worn uniform, Elijah resolved to dig deeper. The good, the bad, and the ugly were only the beginning. He needed to understand the full extent of the issues before he could begin to fix them. And as painful as the truth might be, he knew he had to face it head-on. Elijah's third day as Eli began in the janitorial office, where Doris was already barking orders. "The elevator's acting up again, so you'll have to haul everything up the stairs," she grumbled, her face lined with frustration. "And watch out for that mop bucket. Wheel's been busted for weeks and nobody's bothered to fix it." The janitorial closet itself was a reflection of the employee's experience: cramped, cluttered, and filled with outdated, barely functioning equipment. Elijah glanced at a vacuum held together with duct tape and a stack of cleaning supplies that looked like they'd been bought in bulk a decade ago. It wasn't just the tools that were worn down. The people were too. That morning, Elijah paired with Malik. a janitor in his early 30s who moved with the practiced efficiency of someone juggling too many responsibilities. Malik was friendly, but had an air of exhaustion about him that Elijah recognized immediately. As they worked their way through the office floors, Elijah struck up a conversation. "You've been here a while?" Elijah asked, pushing a creaky cart. "About 3 years," Malik replied, shrugging. "Pays the bills. Well, some of them anyway." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "You work other jobs?" Malik nodded, his expression grim. "Yeah, man. I do night shifts at a warehouse a few days a week. My son's in middle school now, and it feels like every other week there's something to pay for. School trips, uniforms, you name it. His mom passed a few years ago, so it's just me now." The weight of Malik's words hit Elijah hard. He couldn't imagine juggling multiple jobs while raising a child alone. "That's a lot to handle," Elijah said quietly. Malik sighed, leaning on his mop for a moment. "It is, but what can you do? The thing that gets me is, it's not just the money, it's how invisible you feel, you know? Like, I've been cleaning this building for years, but ask me how many people know my name, maybe 2. Elijah stayed silent, letting Malik's words sink in. His experience was a glaring example of the corporate indifference Elijah had started to suspect ran deeper than he'd imagined. Later that day, while cleaning an office kitchen, Elijah overheard a conversation that made his blood boil. 2 middle managers were talking loudly, clearly assuming no one was listening. "We need to cut some slack for the marketing team," one of them said. "They've been running on fumes since the last launch." "Cut them slack?" the other replied, incredulous. "If they can't handle the workload, they're replaceable. This is Apex Solutions, not a charity. We need results." Elijah gripped the handle of his mop tighter, willing himself to stay in character. This wasn't the first time he'd heard this kind of rhetoric over the past few days, but it stung every time. It was one thing to demand excellence, it was another to disregard employee well-being entirely. The day took a more personal turn when Elijah found himself working alongside Carla, a veteran janitor in her 50s with a quick wit and a sharp eye for detail. Carla had been with the cleaning agency for nearly 2 decades, and she wasn't shy about speaking her mind. "You're quiet, Eli," she said as they polished a conference room table. "Most of the new guys talk my ear off." "Just trying to get the lay of the land," Elijah replied with a smile. "What's it been like for you, working here?" Carla snorted. "Depends on the day. Most folks don't notice us unless something's wrong. But it's not the employees that get to me. It's the higher-ups. You wouldn't believe the things I've seen." "Like what?" Elijah asked, feigning casual interest. Carla leaned in conspiratorially. "I've seen people get passed over for promotions because they didn't fit the image. One time, this guy, a real sharp kid, put in a harassment complaint against his manager. You know what they did? Moved him to another department and let the manager stay." Elijah's stomach churned. That doesn't sound right. "It's not," Carla said, her tone bitter. "But this place cares more about appearances than doing the right thing. As long as the numbers look good and the execs are happy, nobody wants to rock the boat." The conversation left Elijah shaken. Carla's story wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern he'd been piecing together over the past few days. The culture at Apex wasn't just flawed, it was fundamentally broken. By mid-afternoon, Elijah had reached one of the engineering floors where employees worked in clusters around glowing computer screens. As he emptied trash cans and wiped down desks, he caught snippets of conversations. "Did you hear about the new project team?" One engineer whispered to another, "All Ivy League grads. Guess the rest of us aren't good enough." "Yeah," the other replied. It's not about what you know here, it's about who you know. Elijah felt a pang of guilt. Had he unwittingly fostered a culture that valued pedigree over potential? He had always prided himself on Apex's meritocracy, but the reality on the ground told a different story. The final straw came during a late afternoon break. Elijah sat in the janitorial closet, sipping water and resting his sore legs, when a younger janitor named Jake walked in, slamming his mop against the wall. "Everything okay?" Elijah asked. "No, it's not," Jake snapped, pacing the small room. "I just got chewed out by one of the HR managers because I didn't move fast enough getting to a spill, like I'm some kind of robot." Elijah frowned. "Did you explain the situation?" Jake shook his head. "What's the point? They don't care. People like us, janitors, cafeteria workers, support staff, we're just part of the scenery to them. They only notice us when they need someone to blame." As Elijah listened, a stark realization hit him. The stories he'd heard from Malik, Carla, and Jake weren't isolated grievances. They were symptoms of a systemic issue. Favoritism, unchecked egos, and a disregard for employee well-being had seeped into every level of the company. Sitting there in the dimly lit janitorial closet, Elijah felt the weight of his discoveries pressing down on him. Apex Solutions was thriving on paper, but its people, the backbone of the organization, were being ignored, dismissed, and disrespected. It was a sobering reminder of how far the company had strayed from the inclusive, collaborative vision he'd once dreamed of. Elijah wasn't just uncovering problems, he was staring at the heart of the issue, and for the first time he began to see the path forward. Change wasn't just necessary, it was urgent. As Elijah stepped into his fourth day undercover, the exhaustion of his double life began to set in. His body ached from hours of physical labor, but it was the emotional toll of what he had witnessed that weighed on him most. Still, he pressed on, determined to uncover every layer of Apex Solutions culture. That day, his cleaning schedule brought him to the finance department, a place where numbers ruled and deadlines loomed like storm clouds. It was there that he first noticed Angela. She sat at her desk, hunched over spreadsheets that seemed to stretch endlessly across her screen. Her fingers moved with mechanical precision, but her eyes told a different story. They were ringed with dark circles, and every few minutes she'd rub her temples as if fighting off a headache. Elijah had seen employees like Angela before, dedicated to a fault, willing to sacrifice everything to meet expectations that only seemed to grow more demanding. As Elijah emptied trash bins and wiped down desks nearby, Angela's phone rang. He couldn't help but overhear her side of the conversation. "Hi, sweetheart," she said softly, her voice warming for a moment. "I know I promised to be home in time for dinner, but something came up. Can you tell Dad to record the recital for me? I'll watch it as soon as I get home, I swear." There was a pause, and then her tone grew heavy with guilt. "I know. I'm sorry. I'll make it up to you. I love you." When the call ended, Angela sighed deeply and returned to her work. Elijah could feel the weight of her frustration and regret from across the room. He continued his tasks, careful to remain inconspicuous, but his heart ached for her. She was clearly sacrificing precious moments with her family to meet the relentless demands of her job. And for what? Elijah couldn't shake the question. Later, while mopping the floor outside a conference room, Elijah overheard a heated exchange that stopped him in his tracks. Raj, a senior data analyst, was being berated by his manager. "Raj, we've talked about this before," the manager snapped, his tone dripping with impatience. "Your presentations are hard to follow. The clients can barely understand you with that thick accent." "I understand," Raj replied, his voice steady but subdued. I'll work on simplifying my slides." "It's not just the slides," the manager continued. "It's everything. Your approach, your style, it's outdated. We need people who can adapt to modern expectations." Elijah peeked into the room just in time to see Raj nodding silently, his shoulders slumping under the weight of the criticism. Raj had been with Apex Solutions since its earliest days, and Elijah knew firsthand how brilliant and dedicated he was. Hearing him dismissed so casually made Elijah's blood boil. It wasn't just unprofessional, it was deeply disrespectful. Raj deserved better, and Elijah silently vowed to do something about it. Amidst these disheartening moments, Elijah also saw glimmers of hope. During his lunch break, he noticed a group of employees gathered around a table in the cafeteria, sharing a potluck-style meal. They laughed and joked, their camaraderie a stark contrast to the tension he had witnessed elsewhere. One employee, Malik, the janitor he'd worked with earlier, sat among them, his usual exhaustion replaced by a rare smile. Elijah also observed small acts of kindness throughout the day. Grace, the cafeteria worker he'd met earlier, slipped an extra cookie onto a tray for a young intern who looked overwhelmed. "Keep your energy up," she said with a wink. Meanwhile, Noah, the IT technician, stayed late to help a coworker troubleshoot a complicated issue, even though it wasn't part of his job. These moments reminded Elijah that Apex Solutions wasn't entirely broken. Beneath the surface, there were still people who cared deeply about each other and their work. It gave him hope that the culture could be salvaged, and that the company could return to the values it had once stood for. As the day wound down, Elijah found himself alone in the janitorial closet, reflecting on everything he had seen and heard. Angela's sacrifice, Raj's humiliation, and the small moments of humanity he had witnessed swirled in his mind. He thought back to his own journey, to the nights his parents worked late to make ends meet, missing school plays and family dinners. Elijah had sworn to himself that if he ever had the power to change things, he would. And yet, here he was, the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company, and his employees were facing the very struggles he had wanted to eliminate. How had this happened under his watch? Had he become so focused on profit margins and growth that he'd lost sight of the people who made it all possible? The thought was like a punch to the gut. Elijah had always prided himself on being a leader who cared, a leader who listened. But the stories he had uncovered over the past few days painted a different picture. Somewhere along the way, the company he had built with such high ideals had strayed into dangerous territory. Elijah knew he couldn't undo the past, but he also knew he couldn't ignore what he'd learned. Angela, Raj, and countless others were counting on him, even if they didn't know it yet. He had a responsibility to them, not just as their CEO, but as a fellow human being. As Elijah left the janitorial closet that evening, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Change wouldn't come easy, but it was clear now that it was long overdue. By Elijah's 5th day undercover, the weight of everything he had witnessed was beginning to take its toll. Each day had been an emotional roller coaster, filled with moments of hope and heartbreak. Yet, nothing could have prepared him for what happened next. A moment that would not only solidify his understanding of Apex's toxic culture but also push him toward taking decisive action. The day began like any other. Elijah was assigned to clean the executive floor, a place of gleaming desks, designer furniture, and oversized windows with views of the city skyline. As he worked, he felt the familiar sense of invisibility. Executives walked past him without so much as a glance, engaged in animated conversations about quarterly earnings and client acquisitions. Elijah was used to this by now, but the sting of being ignored still lingered. Then came the moment that would change everything. Elijah was cleaning the glass walls of a conference room when Linda Porter, the head of operations, appeared. her high heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. She was flanked by 2 other senior managers, their expressions a mixture of deference and discomfort. Linda's gaze fell on Elijah, and her lips curled into a frown. "Excuse me," she said, her tone icy. Elijah turned, nodding politely. "Yes, ma'am." "What do you call this?" she snapped, pointing to a barely visible streak on the glass. Before Elijah could respond, she continued, her voice rising. "Is this your idea of professional work? These are executive offices, not some fast food joint." Elijah felt his face flush with embarrassment. He opened his mouth to apologize, but Linda wasn't finished. "Honestly, this is the problem with hiring contractors. No attention to detail, no pride in their work. If you can't handle a simple task like cleaning glass, maybe you're in the wrong line of work." The other managers stood silently, avoiding eye contact with Elijah. He wanted to tell Linda who he really was, to remind her that she was berating the very person who had trusted her to lead with integrity. But he didn't. Instead, he muttered, "I'm sorry, ma'am. I'll fix it right away." As Linda turned on her heel and strode away, Elijah caught the look of pity on one of the managers' faces. It was as if he were nothing more than a nuisance, a problem to be tolerated. The humiliation burned, but it wasn't just personal. It was emblematic of the deeper issues plaguing Apex Solutions. What happened next, however, was unexpected. Noah, the IT technician Elijah had met earlier in the week, had witnessed the entire exchange. He approached Elijah, his jaw tight with anger. "That wasn't right," Noah said quietly but firmly. "You don't deserve to be spoken to like that." Elijah shook his head, staying in character. "It's fine. She's just doing her job." "No, it's not fine," Noah replied, his voice rising slightly. "People like her think they can treat others like dirt just because they have a fancy title. Someone needs to call it out." By now, a few other employees had gathered, drawn by Noah's raised voice. Grace, the cafeteria worker, was among them. "What happened?" she asked, concern etched on her face. "Linda just tore into him over nothing," Noah explained. "It's not the first time she's treated people like this, and I'm sick of it." Grace nodded in agreement. "She's been like that for years. People are afraid to speak up because she has so much power, but it's not right." For the first time since starting his undercover mission, Elijah felt the power of solidarity. These employees who barely knew him were standing up for what was right. Their quiet defiance against Linda's behavior was a spark, a small act of rebellion that hinted at the possibility of change. The incident also solidified something Elijah had suspected all along. The culture at Apex Solutions was broken at its core. Over the past week, he had gathered evidence of systemic failures, mismanagement, inequities in pay and promotion, and a leadership structure that prioritized results over people. He had heard stories of employees like Angela, who sacrificed family time to meet impossible deadlines, and Raj, whose contributions were dismissed because of superficial biases. He had seen favoritism in action, with certain employees fast-tracked for advancement while others were overlooked despite their talent and hard work. Elijah spent the rest of the day quietly compiling his observations. Every interaction, every overheard conversation, every story he'd been told painted a picture of a company that had lost its way. The problems weren't just limited to a few bad apples. They were embedded in the very fabric of the organization. But as the day wore on, Elijah began to realize something else. Uncovering the problem wasn't enough. He couldn't just document what he had seen and return to his office as CEO, issuing directives from the top down. If he truly wanted to fix Apex Solutions, he needed to lead by example. He needed to show his employees that their voices mattered and that he was willing to take responsibility for what had gone wrong. That night, As Elijah sat in his car in the far corner of the employee parking lot, he made a decision. The time for observation was over. It was time to act. The next morning, Elijah arrived at Apex Solutions with a renewed sense of purpose. He donned his janitor's uniform one last time, knowing that by the end of the day, the truth would come out. His plan was simple but bold: to call a company-wide meeting and reveal his true identity. He would share what he had witnessed and take full accountability for the failures in the company's culture. More importantly, he would present a plan for change, one that prioritized people over profits and fostered a culture of respect, inclusion, and collaboration. Elijah knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be resistance from those who benefited from the status quo, and rebuilding trust would take time. But as he walked through the halls of Apex Solutions that day, pushing his cleaning cart for the last time, he felt a sense of determination he hadn't felt in years. The breaking point had come. Now it was time to build something better. By the end of the week, Elijah Carter knew the time had come. The stories he had heard, the injustices he had witnessed, and the humanity he had both observed and experienced. All of it had led him to this moment. It was time to reveal the truth and confront the culture that had festered at Apex Solutions. That morning, an email landed in every employee's inbox, marked urgent. It was an invitation to an all-hands meeting in the main auditorium, scheduled for noon. No details were provided, but the suddenness of the meeting sparked a flurry of whispers and speculation across the building. Elijah, still dressed as Eli, watched the buzz unfold as employees made their way to the auditorium. When the clock struck noon, the auditorium was packed. The energy in the room was electric, equal parts curiosity and confusion. Employees from all departments filled the seats, their murmurs creating a low hum of anticipation. At the front of the room stood a single podium with a microphone waiting. As Elijah entered from a side door, still in his janitor's uniform, a few people shot him puzzled looks. But before anyone could ask questions, he walked onto the stage. At first, there was silence as the audience tried to process what they were seeing. Then came the murmurs. What was the janitor doing up there? Elijah stepped up to the microphone and took a deep breath. "Good afternoon, everyone," he began, his voice calm but commanding. "My name is Elijah Carter. You know me as the CEO of Apex Solutions, but for the past week you've known me by a different name, Eli the Janitor." A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Heads turned, and people exchanged wide-eyed glances as Elijah pulled off the thick-rimmed glasses and carefully peeled away the prosthetics that had aged his face. He straightened his posture, shedding the stoop he had adopted during his undercover mission. In an instant, the transformation was complete, and the realization hit the crowd like a tidal wave. "For the past week," Elijah continued, "I've been working among you, not as your CEO, but as one of the people who keep this building running. I've scrubbed floors, emptied trash cans, and observed this company from a perspective I've never experienced before. And what I saw, well, it changed everything." The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Elijah scanned the faces in the audience, noting the mixture of shock, curiosity, and unease. Some looked intrigued, others looked nervous, particularly the managers seated near the front. "I want to share some of what I experienced," Elijah said. "Not to single anyone out, but to paint an honest picture of where we are as a company. Because before we can fix what's broken, we have to face it." He began recounting the week, starting with his first day in the basement-level janitorial office. He spoke about Doris, who managed her team with grit despite broken equipment and limited resources. He shared Malik's story, a single father juggling 2 jobs just to stay afloat, and Carla's account of witnessing employees being passed over for promotions due to favoritism. Elijah's voice grew more somber as he recounted the toxic behaviors he had seen. He described the dismissive attitudes of some middle managers, the favoritism in team assignments, and the cutting remarks about employees who didn't fit the mold. He paused before continuing, his tone heavy with emotion. "And then there was Linda," he said, his gaze locking onto her in the front row. Linda Porter, head of operations, shifted uncomfortably in her seat as all eyes turned to her. "Linda, do you remember the janitor you berated for leaving a streak on the glass?" "That was me." The audience collectively inhaled, and Linda's face turned a deep shade of crimson. "I don't share this to humiliate you," Elijah continued, "but to illustrate a larger problem. That moment wasn't just about a streak on a window. It was about a culture that has allowed disrespect and dismissal to thrive unchecked. And that's on me." Elijah turned back to the audience, his voice firm. "The truth is, I let this happen. I became so focused on growth and profits that I lost sight of the people who make this company what it is. That's my failure, and I own it." For a moment, no one spoke. Then, Elijah drew in a deep breath and shifted gears. "But today is about more than accountability. It's about change. Real, meaningful change. And it starts now." He began outlining his plan, his tone resolute. "First, we're implementing a leadership overhaul. Every manager at Apex Solutions, myself included, will undergo empathy and inclusivity training. Leadership is about more than hitting targets. It's about lifting people up." There was a ripple of cautious applause, which grew louder as Elijah continued. "Second, we're introducing transparent promotion criteria. No more favoritism, no more arbitrary decisions. Every employee deserves an equal shot at advancement, based on merit and contribution, not connections." The applause swelled, and Elijah felt a surge of hope. "Third, we're establishing an anonymous reporting system for workplace concerns. If someone is mistreated or sees unethical behavior, they can report it without fear of retaliation. That's non-negotiable." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Fourth, we're increasing wages and benefits for our frontline workers. The people who clean this building, serve in the cafeteria, and support our operations deserve to be treated with dignity and respect." The room erupted into applause, and Elijah noticed a few employees wiping away tears. He wasn't done yet. "Finally, I want to make one thing clear. This isn't about policies alone. It's about culture. It's about treating each other with kindness, respect, and humanity every day, at every level of this company." As the applause subsided, Elijah opened the floor for questions. Hands shot up, and the conversation that followed was a mix of gratitude, hard questions, and raw emotion. Some employees expressed relief that their struggles were finally being acknowledged. Others voiced skepticism, pointing out that promises had been made before. "I understand your doubts," Elijah said honestly. "Rebuilding trust will take time, but I'm committed to seeing this through, and I need your help to make it happen. Together, we can create the company we all want to be part of." By the time the meeting ended, the mood in the room had shifted. There was still uncertainty, but it was tempered by a newfound sense of hope. As employees filed out, many stopped to shake Elijah's hand or offer words of encouragement. Some, like Malik and Carla, simply nodded, their expressions a mix of gratitude and quiet determination. As the auditorium emptied, Elijah remained on stage, taking a moment to reflect. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but for the first time in years, he felt like the company's compass was pointed in the right direction. This wasn't the end of his journey. It was just the beginning. The weeks following Elijah Carter's bold confession were nothing short of transformative for Apex Solutions. Change didn't happen overnight, but the spark ignited during that all-hands meeting began to spread, fueled by Elijah's unwavering commitment to turn his vision into reality. The once stagnant atmosphere of fear and favoritism slowly gave way to one of collaboration, inclusivity, and mutual respect. One of the first visible signs of progress was the reshaping of Apex's leadership structure. Managers across all levels underwent intensive empathy and inclusivity training, designed to teach them how to lead with compassion, listen actively, and value the voices of all employees. Linda Porter, whose toxic behavior had been a glaring symptom of the company's problems, was among those who participated. To the surprise of many, Linda embraced the opportunity for growth. She stood before her department during a team meeting and publicly apologized for her actions, vowing to lead differently moving forward. Though skeptical at first, her team began to notice small but significant changes in her approach, an openness that hadn't been there before. Meanwhile, employees who had once been overlooked were finally given the recognition they deserved. Grace, the cafeteria worker who had been a source of quiet kindness, was promoted to a leadership role overseeing workplace hospitality. Her new position allowed her to implement programs that bridged the gap between frontline workers and the rest of the company. Noah, the IT technician whose integrity had inspired a small act of rebellion, was tapped to lead a new task force focused on fostering cross-department collaboration. And Angela, the long-suffering finance employee who had sacrificed so much for her job, was promoted to a senior management position where she could bring her dedication and work ethic to a broader stage. These promotions weren't just symbolic gestures. They were a signal to the entire company that things were changing. For the first time, employees felt that their contributions were being seen, valued, and rewarded. The impact rippled outward, creating a wave of renewed energy and motivation across teams. Elijah made it a point to stay connected to the ground level, often walking the halls and striking up conversations with employees. His Coffee with the CEO sessions, held in small, informal groups, became a favorite tradition. These gatherings allowed employees to share their ideas and concerns directly with Elijah, fostering a culture of openness and transparency that had been missing for far too long. The company's anonymous reporting system also proved to be a game changer. Within weeks of its implementation, several long-standing issues, ranging from favoritism in promotions to inappropriate workplace conduct, were brought to light and addressed swiftly. Employees began to trust that their voices would not only be heard, but acted upon. One of the most profound moments of change came during a company-wide hackathon. For years, these events had been dominated by the same small group of employees, those who fit the traditional mold of what a successful innovator looked like. But this time, things were different. Teams were deliberately mixed to include voices from diverse departments and backgrounds, creating an environment where everyone could contribute. During the final presentations, May, a young developer who had once been silenced by her team, stepped onto the stage with her group to present an accessibility feature for one of Apex's flagship products. Her idea, initially dismissed as too niche, was met with a standing ovation. Elijah, seated in the front row, couldn't help but smile as he watched her confidence bloom. As Apex Solutions began to heal, Elijah found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. Sitting in his office one evening, he thought about his parents and the values they had instilled in him, values of humility, hard work, and respect for others. Somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of those principles. But his week as Eli had reignited his passion for creating a company that truly lived up to its ideals. "I thought I was building a legacy with our products," Elijah shared during a fireside chat with employees. "But I've realized that our true legacy lies in how we treat one another." The best innovations come from teams that feel supported, valued, and empowered to bring their whole selves to work. As the months went on, Apex Solutions became a case study in corporate transformation. Media outlets picked up on the story, dubbing Elijah the Undercover CEO, and other companies began reaching out for guidance on how to replicate his approach. Elijah, however, was quick to shift the spotlight back to his employees. "This isn't about me," he told a reporter. "It's about the people who make this company what it is. They're the real heroes." Grace, Noah, Angela, and even Linda became shining examples of how a culture of respect and inclusion could elevate not just individuals, but entire teams. Malik, the janitor Elijah had worked alongside, was given access to educational resources and a flexible schedule that allowed him to spend more time with his son while pursuing his dream of becoming a mechanic. Carla, the veteran janitor, was consulted on how to improve working conditions for the cleaning staff, ensuring that their voices were no longer ignored. At a company town hall 6 months after the initial reveal, Elijah stood before his employees once again, his voice filled with pride. "We're not perfect, and we never will be," he admitted. "But what matters is that we're trying, together. We're learning, we're growing, and we're holding each other accountable. That's what makes this journey worthwhile." As the town hall ended, employees left with a renewed sense of purpose. Many approached Elijah to thank him personally, while others shared their own stories of how the cultural shift had impacted their lives. The sense of unity in the room was palpable, a stark contrast to the divisions Elijah had witnessed during his week undercover. For Elijah, this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. He knew there would be setbacks and challenges ahead, but he also knew that Apex Solutions was stronger than ever. The experience had taught him that leadership wasn't about being at the top, it was about lifting others up. And he was determined to carry that lesson forward. As the video draws to a close, Elijah addresses the audience directly, his tone heartfelt. "The changes we've made at Apex Solutions wouldn't have been possible without the courage and resilience of our employees. But this story isn't just about one company. It's about what happens when we choose to see and value the people around us." He pauses, leaning slightly forward. "So, I want to ask you, what's the culture like in your workplace? Do you feel valued? Do the people around you feel valued? If not, what can you do, big or small, to make a difference? Because change doesn't have to start at the top. It starts with all of us, every day." If this story inspired you, check out our other videos about powerful transformations and the people who make them happen. You won't want to miss what's next. Like, subscribe, and share with your friends and family. Thank you for watching.